Good morning, everyone. Welcome this morning to meeting number 53 of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. Pursuant to Standing Order 108-2, a full investigation of the role of a public broadcaster in the 21st century. For the first hour or till 10 o'clock this morning, I'm sorry, we're running a little late. We have our public airwaves as witnesses here this morning, Arthur Lewis and Paul Gaffney, who will lead off. Mr. Lewis.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Arthur Lewis, Executive Director of Our Public Airwaves. We're a voluntary organization devoted to revitalization of public broadcasting in Canada. In the interest of full disclosure, I should confess that I worked for CBC for many years as a reporter and producer in TV news and current affairs. With me is Paul Gaffney, a member of our coordinating committee, and I'll introduce him more fully in a minute. Obviously, your study of CBC and its mandate speaks to the very issues that concern us the most, and we very much appreciate the opportunity to participate in this very important discussion. Our Public Airwaves believes that CBC's current legislative mandate is as relevant today as it was when that act was first written. To fulfill, to fulfill that mandate, we believe CBC needs a long-term agreement with the government, increased multi-year funding, new funding for expansion of regional programming, access to additional TV channels, wider cable and satellite distribution of existing specialty channels, a reduction in reliance on commercial revenue, greater access to cable and satellite subscription fees, and major reform of CBC's governance. The past 2 decades have witnessed explosive growth in the number of new television channels available to Canadians. This growth has created a serious imbalance in our broadcasting system because the vast majority of those new channels have been private commercial services delivering heavy doses of American programming. During the same period, there was almost no growth in the number of public broadcasting channels delivering predominantly Canadian programming. As your committee noted in its 2003 report, CBC Radio-Canada was badly served by the CRTC's repeated refusal of licenses for new specialty channels, while private sector competitors greatly expanded their array of specialty channels. In a recent brief to the CRTC's TV policy review, our Public Airways recommended that the Commission attempt to right this wrong by requiring cable and satellite distributors to provide carriage in their first tier of all CBC Radio-Canada specialty channels. This is in keeping with one of the basic tenets of public broadcasting, universal accessibility. As first proposed by this committee in its 2003 report, CBC should also be encouraged to apply for additional licenses in order to return our broadcasting system to a better balance of public and commercial services. This would provide CBC with substantially more shelf space for the display of Canadian programming, something akin to the multiplicity of channels provided by the BBC. At this point, I'd like to more fully introduce my colleague, Paul Gaffney. Paul spent many years working for CBC, starting as a TV production assistant, and later as a producer and director of news and current affairs, and then TV program manager here in Ottawa, where parenthetically he was my boss. More recently, he was director of strategic planning and senior director of corporate affairs for CBC. He also served as executive director of the Office of the President.
Thank you, Arthur. Ladies and gentlemen, while the question of adequate funding for the CBC is obviously a very serious one, we believe that the premise for any such funding of national public broadcasting has to be an understanding of what the broadcaster's job is and a mutual agreement on how the job is going to be done. These qualifications that we would submit are not in place now, and indeed they have barely existed for the better part of the last 2 decades. Yes, there's a mandate spelled out in the Broadcasting Act, but as we all know, that mandate is intentionally broad. It lays out basic principles, it sets the outlines of what's expected of the broadcasting system and of the CBC as a central part of that system, but it's far from precise. In a broadcasting environment as turbulent as the one we've been experiencing ever since the current legislation was enacted in the early 90s, we think that's not good enough. The fact that your committee is once again addressing the role of national public broadcasting serves to underline the harsh reality that the existing processes haven't worked very well. We would, in fact, submit that the role of the CBC as a critical instrument of national cultural policy has been sadly neglected. In the public interest, we think that has to end, and we believe the very first step toward accomplishing that is for Parliament to forge a new relationship with the CBC, a relationship in which both parties are fully aware of what's expected of the other, binding them in a negotiated covenant based on the Broadcasting Act to achieve those expectations. We recommend that this take the form of a memorandum of understanding between the parties, entered into for a renewable period of 5 years. The understanding would, at the very least, lay out the agreed-upon tasks to be undertaken by the broadcaster. It would establish the standards and benchmarks by which the achievement of goals would be measured. It would provide a mechanism for addressing amendments to the agreement that might be made necessary by unforeseen changes in the environment. And it would assure comparability in reporting results by establishing a template to be followed by the CBC in compiling its annual reports to Parliament. This, by the way, is not a new recommendation. It was, in fact, proposed by this committee in its 1995 report on the future of the CBC. Now, the next really critical bit is that the Memorandum of Understanding would also guarantee the public funding to be allocated over the lifespan of the agreement. This, too, is hardly a new recommendation. It's been made by virtually every investigation into the handling of public broadcasting since the Aird Commission first made it in 1929. It's hard to know what more we could add to support the overwhelming logic of the idea, except to say that condemning the CBC to the uncertainty of annual funding both demeans the political process and, because of its negative effect on the long-range planning the broadcasting business demands, it inherently wastes taxpayers' dollars. Regarding what an MOU between Parliament and the CBC would say, we take it as given that everything would be on the table. Some parts of the broadcasting environment are in flux, some aren't. That should be recognized by both parties through a willingness to change or not change with the times. The objective, after all, is to serve the Canadian public, and there's no hard and fast rule that says that what should be done in 2007 should be done in the same way it was done 50 years earlier or even 5 years earlier. Now, we're obviously not in a position to be definitive about the terms of an MOU. Developing such an agreement would take some significant effort and detailed consultation, as well as a determination to recognize that there are no easy, common-sense solutions to a dilemma that's taken decades to reach the point it's at today. Now, as my colleague Mr. Lewis indicated at the beginning of this presentation, we do have ideas about some of the CBC's problems and about some approaches to solutions to those difficulties. And we're very pleased to have this opportunity to discuss them with you. But so you know where we're coming from, we should tell you something about our values. While we believe that the marketplace can go a significant way toward meeting our cultural and industrial goals in the broadcasting sector, we don't believe it can go as far as we need it to, especially given the overwhelming presence of our next-door neighbor. In Canada's unique circumstances, there are things that we want as a society that simply aren't going to arise from the commercial market, largely because there's no business case for them. If there were, the private sector would long ago have replicated CBC Radio's style of broadcasting. It would have developed hours and hours of commercial-free children's programming on television. It would be giving us a steady diet of purely Canadian drama and entertainment, rather than relying on high-profile U.S. programming to populate primetime schedules. The list could go on, obviously, but the point to be made is that there is a role for public involvement in broadcasting to provide us with the things that speak to us as citizens rather than just as consumers, the things that speak to us as unique in our sphere rather than as members of an undifferentiated North American mass. We believe that the CBC remains the ideal vehicle to achieve those objectives. But we also believe strongly that year-over-year funding and year after year of underfunding of the CBC amounts to a self-fulfilling prophecy for those who think there's no role for public broadcasting in a market-driven economy. You simply can't expect miracles from an organization that has something in the order of $400 million less spending power now than it had 20 years ago. Indeed, it may be argued that the people of Canada are getting a much better deal from the CBC than they have any reason to expect on the basis of what they're paying for it. But the price has been that the company has arguably been forced to focus more time, more effort on saving and making money than it has on providing public broadcasting services so good that the question of what to do with the CBC wouldn't even arise. The fact that CBC television has recently taken to describing itself as a publicly subsidized commercial television network is either a deeply ironic comment on their state of affairs or an abject admission of failure. Either way, we're all losing.
Your committee has already heard many voices calling for increased government funding for CBC, and you are certainly aware of concerns about the degree to which the need for advertising revenue is at odds with the CBC's public service mandate. While we are distressed by the degree to which CBC television has become focused on generating advertising revenue, we want to make it clear that under present circumstances, any new government funding, and we certainly hope your report will call for increased funding, any new government funding must be allocated to more and better Canadian programming rather than a reduction of advertising. There is, however, a suggestion that we recently made to the CRTC that your committee may wish to consider. As part of its TV policy review, the Commission is examining proposals to allow the over-the-air broadcasters to charge cable and satellite subscription fees. Should the CRTC decide to allow such fees, we recommended that it give preference to CBC. Again, first call on any such new revenue should be programming. But we also suggested that a portion, perhaps a third, should be allocated to removal of TV advertising, particularly during news, current affairs, and documentary programming. That would help reduce the commercial character of our public networks. On another topic, our Public Airways believes the current governance structure of CBC Radio Canada is dysfunctional. First and most important is the need for a president who is selected by and responsible to the board of directors. The current process, whereby the president is appointed by order in council, seriously undermines the ability of the board to provide adequate oversight to the administration. To do that, the board must have authority to hire and the power to dismiss the corporation's chief executive officer. Because the president is appointed by the government, it has been deemed necessary to protect CBC from undue influence by appointing the president for a fixed term during good behavior. In practical terms, this means the CBC president is responsible to no one and can't be removed from office no matter how poor his or her performance. Surely this is not acceptable. We also find it unacceptable that the president is not only a member of the board, but serves as its chair when that position is vacant, as has now been the case since last September. Until a new board chair is appointed, the current president is, for all practical purposes, his own boss. What kind of oversight can that possibly provide? Also of great concern is lack of transparency in the process for appointment of the board itself, as well as the board chair. Over the years, this has resulted in numerous appointments of dubious merit. While the issue of governance is vital, action on this must not be used as a cover for inaction on the more important issue of financial support. That CBC Radio Canada must be supported with public dollars is a price we need to pay to provide a modest reflection of our country in a TV universe awash with high-powered programming from across the border. It is in this spirit that we call on your committee to enthusiastically support renewal of Canada's 70-year tradition of public broadcasting. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We'll go to questioning now of our first Andy, or Mr. Scott, sorry.
Andy's fine, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. Appreciate it very much. Read your brief. I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on the BBC process for appointing the board to make it more transparent, less subject to political considerations. One.
Well, in Britain they use something called the Nolan rules, and I won't claim to be an expert on it, but it is a process, as I understand it. My colleague may have more to add on this. It's a process which involves a nonpartisan appointments board which reviews nominations, and nominations are public. It's not, you get an announcement from the PMO that somebody has just been appointed. There is a process, it's public, it's open, anybody can be nominated, and the final result is a board that is generally considered to be nonpartisan and not somehow connected to the political party in power.
On the question of the sort of balance between the public contribution and advertising revenues, and we'll accept, or I certainly would accept the fact that they're under-resourced, and that's caused them to be more advertising conscious than we would want a public broadcaster to be. So I accept all of that. I'm trying to get to the question of the balance, because you don't rule out the idea of advertising. You're simply saying that it's out of balance, and you talked about new funding maybe being allocated to on a two-third, one-third basis, two-thirds for new programming as the first most important piece, and then perhaps one-third being applied to allow them to relieve the program. Did I understand that correctly? Or advertising?
More or less.
Okay.
I just want to clarify, because we were looking at two different pockets of new funding. We think there should be new funding from Parliament, and we think it should all be primarily devoted to new programming. We don't think that the Canadian public have a toleration for enormous amounts of money going to the CBC for nothing that achieves new programming. However, should the CBC be able to achieve the subscription fees from cable, we think it might be reasonable to put a modest amount of that towards reduction. Ultimately, what we believe, and I'll just try and sum this up in one sense, we believe the CBC should not be dependent on advertising revenue, and that should not drive programming decisions.
But the idea of some advertising revenue in and of itself isn't conceptually an automatic negative to you?
Absolutely not. And we don't see any problem with, for instance, advertising on Hockey Night in Canada, other professional sports. We just think that it's a little overdone, and at this point it drives a lot of programming choices. What can we put on? The example that's been given over and over again is during the hockey lockout, the American movies. And while I'm sympathetic to those who put forward the argument that CBC should have been running Canadian movies, the reality is it wouldn't have brought in enough advertising revenue, and the CBC was driven to running American movies. It shouldn't be in the position of having to make that choice.
The process in terms of the 5-year MOU, and how do you envision this playing out? I can understand how it would begin. I'm a little less sure of how it, in year 3.5, year 4, what the discussion, what the debate is. I think we need stable and adequate funding, and I do think we need to re-establish purpose so that everybody's on the same page on that. How do you see that process sort of playing out? And why would that be anything better than simply establishing the responsibility, making it clear, making it transparent, doing all the other things you speak of, and then simply having an adequate budget allocation? How would that be any different?
I think what it really comes down to is taking the view that when you spend money, you have a right to know what you're getting for it. The Broadcasting Act, as we all know, provides the basic guidance. But the process of interpreting the CBC's mandate has been a pretty random affair over the years. It's been a matter of decisions arising from committees such as yours, decisions or recommendations arising from royal commissions, decisions and recommendations and conditions of license arising from license renewal processes undertaken by the CRTC, and so on and so on and so on. That's been the way that the mandate has been interpreted, if you will. We have before us an example of a better system, we think, namely the charter and agreement system that's used by the BBC and has been for some years. It allows for the public, through its elected representatives, to say, this is what we want our national public broadcasting system to do in some detail, bearing in mind that the most critical thing that you guys have to deal with, I think, is the continuing question of the arm's length relationship. We don't want a state broadcaster in Canada, we want a national public broadcaster, and it's that arm's length relationship that makes that critical difference. So bearing that in mind, you still, we think, need to be in a position where you can reasonably say, this is what we want this outfit that we're paying a big chunk of money every year to do. And we want to talk about it in some measure of detail. But we also want to, we want to reduce that incredible and persistent gap between the expectation of service and the payment for service. I mean, that's been the problem with the CBC for a very long time. So the recommendation is a two-part one. It is that there be a process in place that says, this is what we want from you guys, this is how we're going to measure whatever it may be, and this is the amount of money we're willing to put forward to do that. And we're going to commit to doing that over a period of time. Now, you know, it truly is amazing that this has been recommended so many times, literally beginning with the Aird Commission report that started the whole affair in 1929. I mean, it's there in big black and white letters. That talks to the principle. It doesn't, I fear, address the specifics of your question, namely, how do you go about doing it? That's processed. I don't know exactly how you go about doing it, but we have the example of the BBC. It's all there in black and white. Broadly speaking, we all have the business, or many of us have the business experience that guides us in what an MOU really means. You sit down, the two parties, and you say, okay, where are we going, folks? What are we going to try to achieve over the next period of time? And we come to an agreement on that, and we write it down, along with some of those process things that we talked about before. But that's the principle of the thing that we're talking about.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Mr. Coteau.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, gentlemen, and welcome. You spoke about the need of increasing the funding, particularly in targeting programming. So did I clearly understand that? Did you clearly, that is indeed what you've said? Yes? From your perspective, where this would be perhaps part of our recommendations, it would be appropriate to commit the CBC to be obliged to do more reporting and be more transparent. There are creators and stars who are part of these programs, who are behind them. There's a lot of time spent in preparation for these productions, and up until now, we've talked about having accountability that is much more transparent and detailed. But from your perspective, would it be too much for us to require that? Or would it just be the sensible thing to do? Can I answer in English, please? My French is weak. Yes, we can certainly grant you that.
I come back to the arm's length question. I think what you have to do is you have to be prepared to say, we're setting up a process, we're setting up a system, we have appropriate and reasonable oversight over that system. The system is equipped to hire and fire the right people to run it, and those people have to be left to determine what is good journalistic practice and what isn't. And if I can pick on that particular aspect of things. I would submit to you that the minute anybody outside that ambit gets involved in what's good journalism and what isn't, you're on a very slippery slope. You're getting to the point where you're putting yourself in a position to dealing with things that you really don't want to deal with in the final analysis. You have to let the people do what they do, if I'm interpreting your question correctly. So I don't think that you want to make recommendations about details at that level. I think you want to stay at a higher level than that when you're talking about this sort of thing. Ça suffit ou
Is that enough? Yes, we hear you. Thank you. You also spoke about a new source of funding, alluding to a proposal that you had put before the CRTC. Could you give us some more clarification on that? You were talking about satellite services. So who's targeted by that? Would it be the consumer or the provider of the programs? I'd like to hear a little more detail on that from you, please, if I may.
Well, at the moment, there are already satellite subscription fees, and they are collected by primarily the specialty broadcasters, News World, RDI, the Sports Network, and Much Music. All these specialty channels delivered essentially by cable collect now from the cable company a subscription fee, which is passed on to the public. At its TV policy hearings in November and December, the CRTC looked at many issues, and one of the hottest issues that was there was the question, should the over-the-air broadcasters, CBC, CTV, Global Chum, TVA, and so on, should they be allowed to also say to Rogers, any of the cable distributors, you can't have our programming unless you pay us a fee. We haven't yet heard from the CRTC on that. What we are saying, and by the way, Ted Rogers, the preeminent cable czar in this country, opposed, before the CRTC, opposed the idea, but said, if you're going to do it for anybody, do it for the CBC. Don't do it for those other guys because they make lots of money. And we would endorse that. We think this is another way, a reasonable way, of helping to fund our public broadcaster. And we, for instance, adding, let's say, $2 or $4 to the cable bill, certainly not going to be thrilling to cable consumers or the satellite bill, but that would provide a new source of additional revenue to help pay the cost of public broadcasting. And we're saying some of that could be used to reduce advertising. We would certainly hope that this committee would not say all of the new funding for the CBC should come that way. We think some needs to come from Parliament, that the government of this country has to step up to the plate and start paying properly for delivering our public broadcasting service.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. Angus.
Well, it's a very interesting presentation. I think it'd be fair to say at this point in our study, we're starting to see a number of common themes emerge. And there's certainly some consensus on certain areas. The issue of governance structure and the desperate need to deal with this is obviously, it's come up again and again. I think that's a fairly straightforward recommendation we can make as a committee. The other issue that comes up again and again, which is a little more difficult, is the need for increased funding. We hear that everywhere we go. There's not sufficient funding. So I'm interested in the alternative ways of funding, and the more we go along in the study, the less and less I am convinced that there are alternative ways other than just an increased fund from government. For example, lessening the reliance on commercial advertising. If, as you say, we've lost $400 million in the last 20 years out of what we normally had as a pot. If we take any of the advertising dollars out of CBC, I mean, I would imagine they're probably paying somewhere in the range of 300 to 400 million, perhaps. Can we reasonably expect that government will step in the breach at this time?
Well, we don't think so, and we don't think that it's politically saleable for a government to put $300 or $400 million into the CBC to remove advertising, and we don't think there's a necessity for that. It's on the list of, if the government were to say that it was willing to do that, we would first of all say put it into programming, and then if they said, well, okay, but then we're going to give them another $400 million, we wouldn't be adverse to seeing most advertising off the CBC, although on commercial sports and so on doesn't offend anybody. I don't know anybody who's bothered by commercials in the hockey game. They have to take breaks in the game anyway. There's time between the periods. I mean, how much Don Cherry can you take? So, a few commercials are probably...
He's gone to the States. He's a seller. So, a possible mix system then with the reliance on advertising in sports, because the issue that came up the other day is that actually from some of our creative people is that getting an advertisement for a new program on Hockey Night in Canada or during American Idol actually drives viewers to more obscure CBC programs that would not have an audience anyways.
Absolutely.
Okay. I guess the question is on the carriage fee, because I like the idea of it in some ways, but it strikes me as we're talking about basically a TV tax on consumers, and whether or not that's just going to create much more resentment than simply increasing that amount through a government augmenting from the government. In light of what we just saw with the CTF, and we had a national hissy fit from Shaw Cable about having to even pay into the CTF, how do you think we can sell the idea of a TV tax to consumers to pay for CBC?
Well, they're paying it now. They're paying they're paying for News World. They're paying for RDI, as I said. They're paying for the sports network. So, it's a hard, cruel world, and I'm sure that this is going to come back to bite me. But the reality is that the consumers don't get a lot of say in the matter. Nobody asks me whether I want to pay for much music. Nobody asks me whether I want to pay for some of the other specialty channels if I want, certain tiers of service. I pay for programming that I don't necessarily want. That's if the average Canadian has to pay a few dollars to help support public broadcasting, I don't think that's the end of the world. I certainly, there's a limit to what's acceptable, and I would certainly hope that the committee would not see that as the prime way of increasing funding for CBC, but $2 to $4, perhaps staged over a period of time on the cable bill. I'm already paying Rogers, I don't know, it's about $150 a month for all the things I get from them. Another $2. They just went up a couple of bucks. Another $2, who's going to notice? And the people will complain and then pay, and life will go on.
Well, I guess my final question then, because this is where we have different opinions are starting to bump into each other. There is a view out there in the analog world that rabbit ear service must be maintained, that every Canadian who gets free television for CBC, that's part of our social contract. If we're moving towards carriage fees and subscription fees, specialties, basically treating CBC as a specialty service, are we not then disenfranchising the people who watch the Montreal Canadiens back home on Saturday night with their rabbit ears?
Well, that's a difficult question, but as you're, I'm sure, aware, the CBC is already proposing 44 transmitters, which would basically limit its over-the-air high-definition transmission to major cities, and everybody else would be experiencing what the people of Kamloops, British Columbia, are already experiencing. You don't get it on cable or satellite, you don't get it. We think that's wrong, but that may be the only practical way in the future, given the I would suggest a highly unlikely circumstance that the government is willing to put up hundreds of millions of dollars to replicate the existing CBC transmission system. In an ideal world, yes, let's do it. I just don't see the money forthcoming, and certainly in a balance of lesser evils, I'd rather see the money go into programming than towers, and there's always a limit to how much is available. Certainly we have said to the CRTC and would say to you that as the Kamloops situation spreads across the country. In small town, rural, remote Canada, there are no longer TV transmitters for the CBC and probably the private broadcasters as well, that there should be a minimum cost basic service that everybody should be able to get. Whether you waive the subscription fee on that service, probably yes, and only charge it. But because most people in reality take additional services and pay Mr. Rogers and others a lot of extra money for movie channels and American channels and so on. And I wouldn't feel any qualm of conscience about hitting them with another $2 or $4 for public broadcasting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for appearing before us today. When I go into my communities, I don't hear about governance. My residents don't talk about funding. They don't talk about advertising. There's one thing they talk about is relevance. Is CBC relevant to them? And it's the one issue that you haven't touched on in your presentation to us today. When I go into my community, which is Abbotsford, when I talk to people from surrounding communities, typically when you talk about CBC, you're going to be talking about whether it's relevant to them as families, as individuals. Do they see themselves in CBC? And there are many Canadians that do. But increasingly, I hear complaints that my residents don't see themselves in the programming that CBC provides. It's been said that CBC is supposed to be the face of Canada, that we see reflected back at us. And I think there's an assumption that there is one face of Canada that we all agree on. And I would suggest to you that that's not the case. In fact, Canada has many different faces. Although we may have a defining set of underlying values, given our multicultural society, our pluralistic society, something we pride ourselves in, what suggestions can you make that is going to make CBC more relevant to the average Canadian? And let me just point you in a direction. I believe that the appointment of an ombudsman was a good first step. But I suspect there's more we can do to make sure that the programming we show on CBC actually attracts Canadian viewers who are looking for Canadian content, but not only Canadian content, but content that speaks to them and reflects their face back at them. Your comments?
I think your concerns are well founded, and but I would throw back at you this may sound like a trite cliche, but relevance costs money, and if you want the relevance, you got to pay the bill. The CBC, in terms of regional programming, and you've heard many calls already for increased regional programming. The CBC came to the Liberal government of the day about 2 years ago and said we want $87 million to increase our regional programming in television, radio, the internet. Got no take-up, no interest. It just, you heard this committee heard the presentation. A lot of it came in response to recommendations from your 2003 report. The government of the day wasn't interested. Because of that, the CBC went back informally some months ago, I believe it's probably coming on up to a year now, and raised something they call the 2020 plan, which was going to cost only $20 million a year and was only going to deal with radio. It was going to deal with mainland British Columbia, the London, Kitchener, Waterloo area, and the Hamilton area. You heard from those people in Hamilton the other day. The CBC wants to provide service to those areas, doesn't have the money. So show them the money. They'll deliver the relevance. Now, we don't want to talk television, drama, other types of programming that reflects Canadian realities. Again, the CBC, and you've heard all this on Friday in Toronto, is not doing enough. Give them the money. They want to do a lot more drama. Drama is what primarily reflects back our lives, as CBC is trying to do with Little Mosque on the Prairies, and would be doing, I'm sure, in a multitude of ways if it had the money to do it.
Can I give you a little background to this dilemma, because it's one that the CBC has faced for a long time. When the cuts began to get serious in the early 1990s, one of the great dilemmas that was debated internally was how do we reconcile the need to be a national public broadcaster with roots out there in all the communities of Canada and a network service as well. I mean, the hard reality is that, I'll pick a weird number, but I can make a program for, say, $100, and I could put it on the network and it covers everybody. But if I make the same program or some variation on a theme in each of 15 or 20 regions, it costs me 15 or 20 times $100. Well, when money's tight, you begin to say to yourself, economically speaking, it makes more sense to try to make the program at the network level for $100 rather than at the regional level for $2,000, to pick those numbers. Now, what I can also do is I can maybe reach out a little bit into the communities and put a little bit of content into that $100 program and maybe spend $200 on it, but I'm still much further ahead. Problem is, I get to a point where I can't maintain any reasonable semblance of regional production facilities because money is getting too tight. And if I'm going to protect the organization itself, I've got to protect the core, which is the network service. So, I mean, by way of background, the struggle went on at that level. I would argue, however, that as compared to every other television service and radio service in the country, CBC provides a great deal more regional content than anybody else. CBC Radio certainly is rooted right out there.
A little bit more. I'm not only referring to regional programming. I'm talking about people who are complaining about media bias, people who feel that their face is not reflected back to them. We've heard from Aboriginals.
I'm sorry, the sound levels in here, I'm not deaf, but I'm having trouble hearing them.
We've heard from Aboriginals.
Or I could put that on, couldn't I? Sorry. Yeah.
We've heard from Aboriginals. We've heard from Francophones. Just last week in Toronto, we heard from people who want to articulate a conservative voice, that they're not being represented, and they're frustrated that this publicly subsidized public broadcaster is actually not serving the needs of Canadians as broadly as it should. And I think that's the struggle you're going to find out there. If, in fact, CBC becomes increasingly irrelevant to Canadians, it's going to have a tough time sustaining support within Canadian society. So that's a challenge for you to look at and become more specific as you put forward resolutions to this problem.
Yeah.
If you can, please.
I have to say I don't want to dump on another witness, but I read the transcript of Ms. Landolt's testimony, and I thought a lot of it was bordered on the absurd. There wasn't an idea put forward that I think it was on Friday that the ombudsperson at the CBC should perhaps not be a CBC employee, former CBC employee. I think that's an idea that perhaps has merit and should be looked at, and that this person should be seen to have completely clean hands, no bias, no influence. I think that's something that you might want to consider. At the same time, I used to work in the CBC newsroom, and you get in the middle of an election and the phones ring off the hook and the Conservatives call up and they tell you you're biased in favor of the Liberals, and the Liberals call up and tell you you're biased in favor of the Conservatives. You obviously, by the fact that you're here, reside in a riding which has a predominance of Conservative voters. So I would expect you to hear that from from the people in your riding. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the Liberals hear that the CBC is biased in favor of the Conservatives. They can speak for themselves, but
we have to move on. Mr. Broskov.
How much of your case that you've been presenting here is it? Are you talking mostly television, or are you including the radio component of it in a general sense?
Well, we're certainly very. I mean, television is a money eater. So, you know, a lot of the need. There have been a lot of cutbacks in radio, but they're not as noticeable. I mean, as long as you have a voice into a microphone, as I'm doing here now, you don't see the fact that a lot of the people working behind the scenes have been cut and the quality is reduced, the research is reduced, and so on. Good radio takes a lot of money. Good television takes a lot more. So television we all know is the problem child. We're concerned about both.
Okay. In the report that we have, it says, with respect to regional and local programming, the task force noted that the budget reallocations had begun to degrade the CBC's capacity to reflect the regions to themselves and one another. And I'd noticed in my area in particular, which is Thunder Bay, Rainy River, and northwestern Ontario, and the parallel exists for northeastern Ontario. You're talking about a riding that goes from Minnesota to Hudson Bay and James Bay, from Lake Superior to the Manitoba border, 2 time zones, so it's larger than France. All of Northern Ontario, larger than many European countries all put together. So it's huge. And I can see the physical evidence of the reduction in staff, the vacant offices, those types of things from the local bureau. And when I hear about that, is it a trend that we should be concerned about, the reduction, diminishing, the phasing out of those kinds of operations? Because it seems to be kind of an incremental thing where you don't hire a regional manager, where you don't replace a reporter. It's done kind of by attrition and other means, but certainly it becomes something that's plainly evident.
That's how CBC has stayed on the air. You know, I worked in Ottawa at the Supper Hour program for many years. I left in 2000, just at the point that they cut the supper hours back to half an hour, and they cut the staff by 40%. So, and one of the reasons I left was I thought, this is not what I want to do. You know, going to take all the fun and pleasure out of it, rushing to, as we used to say, feed the goat, get something on the air. Recently, when the CBC went back to a full hour, there was no increase in staff. So the same people that were barely hanging on producing a half an hour are now expected to produce an hour. The same kind of thing happens in radio. Certainly you should be concerned. That's why the CBC needs more money.
And those issues of weather, local news, regional issues, the placement of regional stations from coast to coast to coast, to me, is the nature of a public broadcaster, whether it is radio or television. And so you're making a very strong case for it. How do we engage the public to support that? Because even though that many of the places that these regional stations reach, and often the only Canadian radio or television, it's still a matter of finding public support for it, and as has been mentioned earlier by the Conservative side, that there are people who would rather not have this happen.
Well, strangely enough, this circles back to the issue of governance, because I think that I don't want to turn this into a heavy attack, but I think one of the largest failures of the current president has been in selling the CBC to the country. I think the president of the CBC should be on the hustings. He should be out there telling Canadians why they need to invest more in public broadcasting, what public broadcasting could provide them. But when your appointment and your reappointment is determined by the government, when you have to go cap in hand to the government every year for that $60 million that it started with the Liberals, and now the Conservatives are playing the same game. We give it to you. Actually, the Conservatives gave it to the CBC for 2 years, but it's a short leash, and it restrains the CBC. I think some of the onus is on the CBC to go out and do this, but it has not, unfortunately, been making its case to Canadians in nearly a forceful enough way.
Then it all comes down to, is it a legitimate concern for regional broadcasters? Should we as elected representatives, be engaging our constituents to support the local programming in a more active way? Is there a role for the elected representative?
Well, here. You know, I would love to see the CBC doing it, but I also love to see MPs, you know, getting their constituents in Hamilton, London, Guelph, the mainland of British Columbia, and several other areas out there, you know, beating on the doors of the CBC and the government and saying, there's no point beating on the doors of the CBC, actually. They want to do it. They just don't have the money. Saying, you know, we want this service. So I would encourage you to agitate and advocate. The more voices, the better.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Coteau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to move away from this discussion to talk about on a more philosophical plane. Having a public broadcaster like the CBC, SRC, should they really become, as is the case in Eastern countries, the real sounding board of the government's ideologies and positions? Is that something that should happen today?
Absolutely not. Est du ressort d'un diffuseur public?
Should it be the duty of a public broadcaster to promote certain political ideas? For example, federalism versus sovereigntist ideas. Should the public broadcaster take a position in that kind of a debate?
I think that the hard reality that we all have to face with a public broadcaster is that the responsibility of that broadcaster, very simply put, is to reflect the reality of the nation. We know that the Broadcasting Act of 1968, for example, contained a clause that was intended to cast the CBC in the role of the promulgator and booster of federalism in this country. That was subsequently changed in the 1991 Act, and there was much consternation about it at the time. I'm one of those people who feels that the change, however motivated, and I have to tell you I strongly suspect the motivation of it, but I think it was the right thing to do. I don't think that the national public broadcaster we're back to this distinction between a state broadcaster and a public broadcaster. Citizens in a free and open democracy such as ours have the right to expect of its national public broadcaster and of any broadcaster balance in coverage. I'm addressing in a certain way the question that Mr. Fast raised as well. It's difficult to do. It's immensely difficult to do, to stand above the fray, as it were, and try to be objective about it. We're all human beings. We're going to make mistakes every day of our lives in trying to do that. But I think that's what the striving has got to be. The minute the CBC, Radio-Canada, becomes an instrument of the government of the day is the day that we might as well fold its tent and say goodbye to it, very simply put.
I'd just like to add, I hate to keep going back to governance, but there's a governance issue here too. The very fact that the board and the president and the chair are appointed by the government of the day does create a public perception of a broadcaster under the thumb of the government. And I think it's very important. As a former CBC employee, I can tell you I never felt the hot breath of the government on my back, and I never felt that I was constrained in any way. But there's a public perception that I think is very dangerous, and I think it's very important that the CBC be further isolated, be further removed from the government through a better, more transparent appointment process.
Thank you very much, and that brings this part of our meeting today to a conclusion. So we'll recess and ask our next witnesses to come forward.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll bring the meeting back to order again, and we welcome our next witnesses from Francophonie de Timmins, and Pierre Belanger, Chair of the Board. If you would introduce your other people, or your other person, and please bring your presentation forward.
Tout d'abord, j'aimerais...
First of all, I would like to thank the committee for having invited us and taken our brief, and to allow us to make a presentation that further explains our position. I am the chairman of the board of the Alliance de la Francophonie de Timmins. Sylvain Lacroix is the executive director. Our organization serves a population of some 19,000 francophones in Timmins and region, and our role is essentially to foster the vitality of French linguistic minority communities in our region. We do so by creating partnerships with other organizations in the health, education, and social services sectors, as well as the economy and cultural development. One of the organizations that we often have the opportunity to work with and to discuss our position with is obviously Radio-Canada. Radio-Canada plays would qualify as essential in fostering the vitality of French communities outside of Quebec. If you read our brief, we'll not spend too much time reading from it because we'd like to answer your questions, but you know that without Radio-Canada, it would be almost impossible for our communities to fight assimilation, but above all, to promote and develop a dynamic culture, and particularly to have an adequate or appropriate socio-economic development in our communities. What we really want to say clearly here is that we want to give the perspective of those Francophone communities outside of Quebec, and what we hope to have shown is that if there was any partial privatization of Société Radio-Canada, or if it disappeared, it would be catastrophic for our communities. Already, with the budget cutbacks of the 1990s, we saw a very real and particularly negative impact on our communities. What we've been able to keep on the radio side, we see that we are very well served, and Sylvain is going to deal with that part of our presentation. We feel that things have been maintained well, but for television, we had an Ontario public affairs show that was out of Toronto, and that served us quite well. But now we get our signal from Ottawa, and obviously it's the Francophone community of the Outaouais and Western Quebec that is what is most important. So whether it's in terms of news or what happens in other areas, we feel that we're not well served in Northern Ontario, and we feel very marginalized compared with what we represent as a percentage of the population. I'll give Sylvain the floor. We in Timmins, we have 4 services that are offered by the public broadcaster. There is the Première Chaîne of Radio-Canada, which is CBON from Sudbury. We have the SRC television cable, and we also serve through cable, and we have the Réseau de l'Information, which is the French news world, as well as internet services. And what we do not have access to as francophones are the following. We wouldn't have the equivalent of Radio 2 in French, and we don't have access to Arts TV either, unless you have cable. In our brief, we make a recommendation that is very important in our opinion. That is that there is a lack of vision. At least we do not see the francophonie outside of Quebec on the airwaves, whether it's in radio or in television. And one of the recommendations that we're making is that these national broadcasts, like the Téléjournal at 11 o'clock, or with the radio show that Céline Charette has on the national radio in the morning, that they have a quota, that they have a set number of minutes that they must use to talk about Francophone communities outside of Quebec, whether it's in terms of culture, of achievements, or of our problems and concerns. And I think that in that regard, Radio-Canada would become a much more national network. And we state in our brief that we understand very well that the majority of Francophones in Canada are in Quebec, but it has to be recognized that there is a population of 1 million Francophones outside of Quebec, and there's some 6 million Francophiles as well. So, and finally, the last message we want to really give today is that the Francophone communities that are not in the major centres, like us in Timmins, are often treated like second-class citizens by Radio-Canada because they don't talk a lot about us. They don't speak to our accomplishments. And I would like on that note to thank you for giving our association the opportunity to come and meet with you here today. And we hope to have fruitful exchanges with you, and that in the end, Radio-Canada will more fully fulfill its mandate and speak to the Francophone population of Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You heard my earlier initial question about the budget reallocations, and clearly Northeastern Ontario, indeed, which is the prime area for the Francophonie, would be more or less subject to the same situations that is happening in Northwestern Ontario. Are there visible signs of the reduction, the phasing out, the diminishing on the radio side? And what would give you your main cause for concern for the privatization on the television side?
Je vais la répondre en français parce que mon...
I'll answer in French, if I may, because my English is limited. In terms of radio, the cutbacks were not as keenly felt. The radio service is still able to talk about us, to reflect our reality at the regional level. It's not at the national level still, but in terms of television, if you look at the regional broadcast in Ontario at 6 in the evening for Francophones, I had the opportunity to watch it over the last 2 weeks to make sure I was ready for my appearance here, and there was, in the hour, there were 2 or 3 reports on the Franco-Ontarian community, and the rest concerned national events or provincial events that didn't necessarily affect our community at home. So in terms of television, we've been badly hurt by the cutbacks, and I would even go so far as to say that we're almost no longer present on television. And if I can add something to that, I'm a teacher, and in the past, I'm talking 20 years back, when these cutbacks first started happening and when they got more severe, the production center in Toronto was closed and it was amalgamated with Ottawa. And all of a sudden, I'm giving you an example here, television is a very important medium because it allows youth to see themselves and their community. And you have made these comments for other regions of Canada as well. Now, I'm talking about Génie en Herbe.
Nous avions une participation des...
We had 17 of the 24 Francophone schools in Ontario that participated. It was all organized in Toronto. And there was a real and concrete participation for young people from our communities with that kind of a project. Everyone went to Toronto. They knew it was important. Everyone learned of the existence of others, and it was a very high quality, high caliber show. And all of that disappeared overnight because at one point in time it was reduced to 4 schools. It became national when the production center was dismantled, and then we had 2 schools only participating, and then it died. So I can tell you, for a small community like Kapuskasing or Hearst, where you have populations of 10 or 12,000, it was really dramatic. I can tell you that being part of the minority, and this reminds me, in a way, what Marshall McLuhan said: when we don't see ourselves in that box on television, we don't exist. So it was a real shock. Afterwards, things were folded in, and now when there are extraordinary events, we might appear on television, but in terms of everyday cultural events, we are just disappearing off the airwaves, except for radio. So that doesn't encourage students to use the public broadcaster to do any research or to learn something. When children are adolescents, they are more self-centered anyway.
We heard mention of the Kamloops situation, but in much of rural Canada and small communities who are compelled by having no choice to use satellite or cable, so that you may be receiving your news from Detroit or, depending on what part of the country, Seattle or Boston. What has happened in northeastern Ontario with the diminishing of even the English language television? So that must be severely compounded on the French side. Can that ever be addressed by having regional desks or some other format at CBC?
Oui, ce serait une partie de la solution.
That could be part of the solution, that we bring back regional offices for the SRC, but we also believe that there has to be local programming on top of having regional offices, because we have to have time on the network that is reserved for local news, so that people within these communities can speak to each other. At the same time, this local office should be used to offer news to the national office. So that's why I say it could be part of the solution, and it should happen. And I'll remind you that every day we lose francophones outside Quebec in these small communities. We need to take care of them. Thank you. Madame Bourgeois. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you very much for speaking French at this committee. That's very important, because we do have the interpretation services and we are francophones. We have to show the world that we speak French. I wanted to ask you, first of all, I read your brief, because everything that affects francophones outside of Quebec interests me tremendously. So I'd like to know, on page 4, you talk about a national identity, and you say that you believe that the government, through the CRTC, should impose a certain content outside Quebec in order to promote a national identity, in order that would also promote that. So can you explain that to me, exactly what you mean? We believe that national unity is not an issue of federalists versus sovereigntists or autonomists. We believe that the way in which this country can be the best is that we have the opportunity to speak to each other, and the way in which we can do so is for us to have some network time on the national show. You're talking about network time for francophones, because there is a lot for anglophones. It's mainly English television. Well, no, in Timmins we receive all of the signals for French television, and we have the private French radio as well. But we're talking just about the French television service of the CBC here. So we believe that if we were to promote our francophone artists outside of Quebec, that our reality would be better. We would have a better dialogue with our brothers and sisters in Quebec. That's what we say to ourselves. We do not want to get into a discussion of the constitutionality of the country and what Quebec might become. We have a Crown Corporation right now that's called Radio-Canada, the CBC, and we have a network that is right now programmed with 95% on the French side for what's happening in Quebec. So if you've heard Christiane Charrette's excellent program, a lot of people listen to it, and if you played some Franco-Ontarian music on that show, then people in Quebec would buy it, and our people could earn a living from that. Well, yes, that's wonderful, but you will agree with me that using terms like national identity and national unity does not have the same meaning for you as it might for certain members of this committee. I think you have to be very careful. That is why I asked you for some clarification. Now, having said that, I understand your frustration in the sense that when the members of this committee go into other Canadian provinces, and I've often stated this, the cable operators in hotels, for example, show cartoons on the French station, whereas on the English station there are programs and public affairs and news where you can see what's happening in the country. So having said that, if I understand correctly, if you did not have the French television from Quebec and the shows that are programs that are created in Quebec, you would have almost nothing. No, that's right. We'd have almost nothing. And just to come back to the issue of identity, it's very important both for Francophones outside Quebec and for Francophones inside the province to be able to understand what the reality is for other groups, because there are many Quebecers that imagine that beyond the borders of Quebec there are no Francophones, and it's sad because we really would have the means for them to get to know the other Francophone communities, and we could get to know each other, and we could be much more effective when it is time to make demands for French services. Your problem, we see it often, and it affects, in fact, it's affected by the CRTC's jurisdiction. I think that this is part of all of the discussions. Do we want a really national television service where we want to understand the realities of other Francophone communities and other Anglophone communities as well? But go ahead. Well, in terms of Franco-Ontarian television production, we have TFO, which is the provincial public broadcaster. It produces public affairs and news shows in French as well. It's not exclusively from Quebec that we have news, but it is a very major portion of it, yes. Well, what I want to say is that Quebecers overall understand quite well the difficulties that Francophones outside of the province face. But if Quebecers want to protect their own television sector, it is indeed to avoid facing the problems that you have had to face, because we wanted to develop SRC so that it reflects Quebec, and you see that reflection in your community. But I understand that in your community, on the financial level and in terms of your own identity as Francophones, you very badly need for English Canada or for English Canadian television to recognize your existence. And moreover, there is a problem with English television. It is more and more swamped by American programming, American television, and you would understand that the Francophones in Quebec are trying to help you with that. Well, this is perhaps the only difference of opinion we may have. We're not asking the Anglophones to create television for us. We're asking the French service of the SRC, of CBC, to help us, to recognize us and to help us create some programming. So I understand that we have to protect our institutions. But the CBC is a federal institution, and it has to protect francophones outside of Quebec. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you for your presentation this morning. I agree with you that the CBC SRC plays a critical role for communities in North Ontario, in the north of Ontario. But this morning, I'm interested in the obligation, the duty of the CBC to reflect the reality in the north. So, how many francophones live in the region of CBON in Northern Ontario? Well, the CBON covers all of Northern Ontario, north of Mattawa, east to west. So we're talking about 150,000 francophones. So, for the is the francophone population, is it the same as the Abitibi in Northern Ontario? Yes. Now, I think that in our region, it's not only our region, the problem for the SRC is that it is more and more like the CBC. In fact, the CBC is more and more focused on Toronto, and the SRC is more and more focused on Montreal. So for us, it's obvious that with all of the cutbacks and the dismantling of the regional services that we used to have, coverage is minimal. As I said, if there's a catastrophe or something exceptional that happens, we're covered, but otherwise, no. Even in Quebec, there are many regions like Abitibi-Témiscamingue and the Gaspé that have problems with Radio-Canada because they, too, have suffered from the cutbacks in terms of regional coverage, and they don't necessarily see their reality reflected. They don't see their daily concerns on television, or at least it's less and less so, because it is more and more focused on what happens in Montreal. When we carried out the feature film study, we heard several times that the role of the SRC is indeed to promote the star system within Quebec. In Northern Ontario, we have a great many artists in dance, theatre, music. Do you think that the SRC really should play a comparable role for francophone artists across the country? Well, we believe it would be very important, yes, that they have the means to do so. And I can't say, Mr. Angus, exactly what it would be, but they should promote the culture of all the francophone communities across the country. And I know that in Timmins we have a theatre group that's called Les Maringouins du Nord that produce 2 plays per year. They write the play, they build the sets, they have a 160-seat theatre, they put on 8 shows for each play, and every performance is sold out. So maybe the CBC, SRC could give them some help and build them a bigger hall, for example, where they could have 250 people, where they might actually be able to make some money to help them with future theatrical productions. You made recommendations to improve the relationship between the SRC and Northern Ontario and Northern Manitoba francophones. Can you explain your recommendations concerning the need to have this quota? Well, I don't like the word quota so much, but what we believe is that within the national programs, not the regional ones. Once again, I'm talking about the 10 o'clock news or Christiane Charrette's show in the morning. We think that there should be a part of those programs that is devoted to what is happening outside of Quebec in terms of francophones, not in terms of tar sands and pollution or other issues, to talk about the cultural reality of our communities. We think that we could build a really solid exchange between Quebec culture, Acadian culture, Franco-Ontarian culture, and the rest of the country. So that's the level that we are talking about. That's what we like to see. We're not wanting the government to tell Radio-Canada, CBC what to do, but what we're saying is that being as it's funded by the federal government and controlled by the CRTC, that you will be able to hopefully ask the questions and maybe push them to take 20 minutes of a 3-hour show and talk about the issues that are of concern to us in Northern Ontario as Francophones. I think if I could complete what Sylvain was saying, that in the past, when we had better television coverage, we did produce artists who were extraordinary and who were known not only in Quebec but on the English side in Canada as well. If you think about Cano from Sudbury, for example, there are many artists like Robert Paquette, and there are new ones like Danny Robillard. CBON has done a great job on that. They've been able to run song contests like you see in Quebec as well, but there could be much more. We have theater groups that are having a problem getting themselves known because there's so little coverage. There's a great deal of work that remains to be done, whether it's theater in Northern Ontario or La Nouvelle Scène here in Ottawa. There is a great deal of wealth in terms of the cultural life that we have that is having a hard time breaking through. There is Patrice Desbiens, who is very well known in France now as well as across the country, and other poets as well. But they've never really gotten what they deserved. There are people, playwrights like Jean-Marc Dalpé, who now lives in Montreal, and he's made a career for himself in Quebec. But those are all Franco-Ontarian artists, and there are new people coming up the ranks. But we always have to fight to ensure that programs like Ontario Pop, that is on the radio, that will come back in years to come, so that will give these people a place. It's very difficult for us. It's rather a no-star system that we have. We would like there to be a forum for these Francophone artists outside of Quebec, because they just don't have the opportunities to get themselves known for now. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for coming this morning and giving us your perspectives. I guess representing also some communities that are French-speaking in my riding, Northern Alberta, I can relate from my constituents. I can relate that they have expressed the same concerns that you're bringing today. This expression that, yeah, it's great to have a bilingual broadcaster or a French broadcaster into their communities that they can get if they subscribe to it, but unfortunately, it doesn't reflect who they are, and it reflects a Quebec reality. And I'm just wondering if we could just talk about it a little bit more. Obviously, there's a mandate for the current mandate really outlines for Radio Canada and for CBC that they should reflect the linguistic minorities and the circumstances of those minorities. It doesn't say that there should be a provincial boundary to that expression. That it should be simply an expression of those linguistic communities. And obviously, you've expressed there's some concern with regards to your community, and also I would say that the same expression is coming from my own constituents. Also, in the Broadcast Act, there is actually it's very clear that. I'll just read here. It's they are to contribute to a shared national consciousness and identity. And I would suspect that is maybe a coded way of saying that they should promote a national feeling of camaraderie between communities of a particular language, and probably even across linguistic lines as well. I'm just wondering if that's yours, if you believe that that's probably the original intent of the Act is to cross those boundaries as well, and if you can just talk about how working to this direction might help with the whole issue of national unity and the whole issue of unity across the country from between communities.
The best way ou la meilleure façon de faire ça, c'est.
I think the best way in which to do that, because it's true, it is part of the mandate of the CBC, but the best way in which to do so would be to give a voice to the various communities. which is what we're saying. We're not saying that what is done in Quebec is not important. We're not wanting to take anything away from them. But for us, within the mandate of the CBC, because of the brutal cutbacks that the CBC has been subjected to, is that they saved the ship, but they've forgotten certain parts of that boat. So we're in one of those forgotten corners. We want absolutely to have a strong CBC in Quebec in every domain, in the theater, in book publishing, anything you choose. Without Quebec, we wouldn't exist. So what we're saying is that if we want to have a true dialogue between the regions of Canada, we have to be given a real voice. It's very important for Franco-Ontarians to know that there are Anglophone communities that experience the same difficulties, and this is a fact, it's a reality. With the current television reality that we're experiencing, things are based on a much more market-driven model and taking into account the cost of production. So it's not ideal. We'll never be able to provide the same service across the country if that's the system. Cable companies won't provide the same access, for example, and that should be guaranteed if we really want to have a national public broadcaster. If we want to give a voice to all of the regions in this country and to allow people to let their reality be known, to let them talk about their complaints and their achievements, I think that's where we'll really have a debate, and that's where we'll reinforce national unity. As Mr. Chrétien was saying, it's not through propaganda that we will be able to reinforce national unity. We may be some kind of mistake of history, but that's the way it is. CBC Radio-Canada has always done a terrific job in terms of news because it was detested both by Federalists and by Sovereigntists. And during the last campaigns and during the referendums, everyone hated them. So to me that says that the journalists really maintain their objectivity and some kind of balance. But I think that if you understand my comments, well, that's the way in which we can talk about national unity.
And probably lived that out in every other capacity of his life. But I guess, and that's what I was, I guess, curious about is just the sense as to that maybe it's not the mandate that needs to be changed. Maybe it's the carrying out of the mandate when it comes, because it looks to me as though there's a clear expression of intent here in the mandate that this be the reality, that the concerns that you have and that my constituents have should be addressed quite easily within the mandate. I think that there's ability for that to happen. I'm just curious if there's anything that you think needs to be added to the mandate that would be essential to ensuring this type of a movement going forward.
Yes. Well, I agree with your comment. We believe that the CBC has all of the tools it needs to be able to really deal with its mandate, with the exception of having the necessary funds. They need a lot more money. So we don't believe it's an issue of the mandate, nor is it a ratings issue, because especially when I look at the difficulties for the CBC,
that they're going to cancel show because there's only 500,000 or 600,000 people watching it, and there's 2 million Canadians watching American Idol. Well, I don't think that's an excuse. I don't think it's an excuse to cut, because when that show was produced, the artistes of English Canada ou du Québec et du Canada français,
or from Quebec or from French Canada,
600,000 people. So we have to stop to look at CBC as a place where everybody should be watching or listening, but more like if we need to have more sense of what we are as a Canadian, we should be able to go to CBC.
Yeah, and I think that goes to, and I'll just end it with this. I think it comes back to the issue of relevance, and of course, there's the issue of chicken and egg. You know, the funding and the issue of relevance, and certainly, I think there's going to be a debate that carries out as to, you know, what comes first, or how can it better be? How can we ensure that if one comes, the other will follow? And so, I do appreciate your coming here and testifying this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Scott.
Bonjour, bienvenue.
Good morning and welcome. I come from New Brunswick, and I understand the importance of CBC SRC for francophones outside of Quebec.
An alliance that we would have as a New Brunswicker, independent of just the language question. Absent the CBC, even in the capital of the province of New Brunswick, absent the CBC, we would not see ourselves at the supper time news. We would be watching ATV out of Halifax. It would give us some coverage, but certainly not what we have come to expect from CBC. So I think that there's a broad question about not only seeing ourselves on a national public broadcaster, but also wanting the rest of Canada to see us in ways that are unique to our regions. And I think, as I say, this is the example that we would see from Acadie and Moncton and Radio-Canada. That's obvious, but it's not unique to that. I think there's a broad issue here. The problem we will have, I think, is how do we deal with the arm's length relationship with a public broadcaster? I think we share a view that resources are a problem. In order to generate the kind of consensus in the country, less difficult for me perhaps than for some of my colleagues, but in order to generate the consensus in the country to support the CBC to the extent which would be necessary to meet the mandate that is spelled out in the Broadcasting Act, there are certain expectations. In our case, it would be regional, both on the Radio-Canada side, which would have many of the same concerns, not perhaps as vividly as you would express them, because I think that because Radio-Canada has a presence in Moncton, Acadie is served perhaps the best outside of Quebec in French-speaking Canada. But regardless of that, we would want there would be certain expectations for that expenditure. Yet, because we're politicians and there's an arm's length relationship, it's hard to say we will increase the budget of CBC, but here's what we expect for that. What happens if we don't see it? What happens if we don't have an increased budget for local supper time news, or an increased budget for the kind of service that you expect?
Yes, it is a complex issue, and it's a complex debate, because I don't think that the elected members here should say tell the CBC what to do and what to say. I understand that. But I do think that because the CBC is a Crown corporation, it is funded by the state, I think that there could be some very clear parameters that would be identified. I think that it should be told, for example, that it should invest $100 million into local and regional programs. And so I think, we're not telling them what to do exactly, but just giving them the parameters, and telling them how they might best serve these communities. And I think that in that way, the politicians won't be telling the artists what to do, but just telling the administrators something. Because there again, the management of CBC are not necessarily people who are artists. They're there to manage these budgets. And so they should maybe just be told to a little bit about how to spend that budget. And in that way, we might deal with some of the regional difficulties we're discussing here. And I'll be surprised if this would happen over the next few years, but I think that the mandate should perhaps be a little bit clearer in terms of the services that it should offer to all Canadians. But understanding that the political reality is what it is right now, it's not an easy thing to do.
So far had been around information programming, news, seeing yourself in the. What about drama? Expand a little bit, just for the record, in terms of the importance of the dramatic, the role of drama in telling those stories in addition to information.
Particulièrement du côté francophone.
Well, particularly on the francophone side, dramatic programming is particularly important. So for people who follow the SRC, they have seen shows that have really changed their opinions about things. Séraphin, for example, is another one, or Le Temps d'une Bête. These are drama that have been extremely important, not only for Quebecers, but for people outside the province, because it explained to us how we came to be what we are today. The argument I make is, why are people always saying that we couldn't put together a good francophone drama in Toronto or in Vancouver? Why not? Because TFO does it. They're currently shooting a 12-episode series in Sudbury with francophone artists, but also involving Quebecers. So I think it's in that way that we will really foster that kind of exchange that I was talking about between exceptional Quebec artists and how we can better help the young artists who are coming up the ranks in the rest of the country. I don't know if that answers your question, Mr. Scott. Madame Bourgeois. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First question. In your brief, you say that in terms of the funding for the national broadcaster, you would like them to be able to continue selling advertising so that they can fulfill their mandate, knowing that their budgets are too small for the moment. Would you be prepared in Northern Ontario to pay more for, I don't know, to pay a cable operator, for example, who would bring you more French programming, or would you be prepared to pay more for the CPC? Well, I think that's an interesting question, because the previous witnesses made me think about all that. What I can't understand, I pay $54 per month for cable services currently, and I'm told that not a penny of that goes to the CBC, which is the station I watch the most, the French CBC. So I don't think it's an issue of charging more, but I think there has to be a redistribution of those monies to the people who have a right to it. Because if I watch the CBC in French 90% of the time, how come 21 of those $54 don't go to the CBC? So, I mean, there are people who might tell me that it's a simplistic example, but the money, I believe, is there. It's just not equitably distributed. Well, and which brings me to the idea of partnerships. You were suggesting that, particularly for television, with schools. You were talking about educational television in Ontario, so you would like to see greater partnerships with the SRC and CBC. But before giving my president or my chairman the floor, I would like to make a couple of comments. The Francophones outside of Quebec have one religion, and it's called the Montreal Canadiens. We don't see any of their games outside of Quebec anymore. The sports channel of the CBC was showing their matches outside of the province. And now the new Olympics, for the next Olympics, will have TQS. The CBC, as the national broadcaster, the public broadcaster, because TQS isn't broadcast everywhere, they should say, we'll lend you the signal and we won't charge you for it, and you'll be able to broadcast the kind of flagship events. We have young Franco-Ontarians who are participating in the Olympics, and we will not be able to see them in French, even if you live in Sault Ste. Marie. So that's one of the first partnerships I would suggest, and I will leave Pierre to talk about education. Okay, in education, it's obvious that we have an educational channel that could certainly work in partnership with the CBC, SRC in many areas, because it is a station that wins prizes internationally and produces wonderful pedagogical programming. So clearly, we need to increase the direct funding from the state, but also we have to be creative. And we should not be increasing the revenues that come from advertising, because the danger there is that you always move towards what is the most profitable in the short term. And if that's the case, that will kill the partnerships that already exist in the cultural world. With film in Quebec, for example, I think it can be a dangerous path to take. Well, gentlemen, I have a lot of difficulty following your brief here, because it doesn't seem consistent. You want to ask for certain things to protect your identity as francophones, and in order to do that, you need the French language services of the CBC, which is done in Quebec. Well, no, which exactly, that's the thing. We don't want it to all be done in Quebec. Okay, well, it's just that you referred to a series that's typically Quebecois. Well, yes, but in the past, there used to be a Franco-Ontarian series called Francoeur that was a huge success, and there were Francophone artists from Quebec and from outside of Quebec in there, and it was broadcast on the national network. That is the solution we are proposing. What is produced in Quebec is very important, whether it's the Beau Dimanche or other shows, but we need our place too. We need to have we need to have our spot. We want to be a partner. And a little bit what happens in Rouyn-Noranda or the Gaspé. People don't want to just receive what's done in Montreal. They want to do something that's from their region as well. They have good artists. They have all kinds of people. And this is the whole battle of Victor Beaulieu. Now, watch out with when invoking that name, sir. I'm sorry.
Question, please. And because we have to wind up by 11 o'clock.
A very quick question, and it was prompted by my friend Mr. Scott raising the question particularly about New Brunswick, taking into account specifically the Acadian community in New Brunswick. When we did the study on broadcast, I was very interested in the facilities that Rogers had in terms of their nightly programming. It seems to be a well-developed programming. Have you had any input or any discussions with Rogers about that nightly programming, which, to the best of my knowledge, would have been in English, about the possibility of getting onto that with French programming?
Well, first of all, we don't have Rogers in Northern Ontario. We have Persona, and actually right now Persona is not only in English. They do though focus what we do, but no, they don't give us any time actually.
Okay, thank you
for that, and we will adjourn.